Shotgun. Good morning, everyone. We are so happy to welcome you to our 5th Nantucket Book Festival. You are fantastic to take a little move from the Athenaeum to be able to fill our wonderful space. I am Mary Haft. We want to say thank you because we would not be here without all of your support. We want to particularly thank some of our most generous sponsors. We want to say thank you to Jill and Stephen Karp at the Nantucket Island Resorts, the Nantucket Athenaeum, the Nantucket Historical Association, the Enquirer and Mirror, N Magazine, WCAI, and we want to say a particular thank you to Heather Reisman, Indigo Books, and Jennifer Diamond. They've been with us since our beginnings. And to Wendy Schmidt, who gave us a very generous matching grant of $25,000 through the Schwab Charitable Foundation, and any donation made throughout the course of this weekend will be matched. So we would appreciate any gifts, and you know, we try to say it's like strength in numbers. $10, $100, like that is fantastic for us. So please silence your cell phones. We are 14 years into America's longest running war. Conflict that began in Iraq and stretched into Afghanistan, and left its mark on millions of human lives, Iraqis, Afghans, and Americans. These are not wars that most Americans touch, feel, reckon with. For most, war is a terrifying headline to glance at, perhaps to read, and then to turn the page. For some of us, war came home. I am the mother of a Marine, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, a weapons platoon commander in a unit known as the Walking Dead, a moniker given to a legendary unit out of Vietnam. A name that gave me little comfort when Michael deployed to Afghanistan in what was known as the killing season. Michael commanded 60 men and brought 60 men home, ranks that are now dramatically thinned by suicide. That is the reality of these wars. Tim O'Brien, author of the seminal work on Vietnam, The Things They Carried, talks about a moral schizophrenia. Into this complex tangle of geopolitical and human costs of war, we are honored to have this distinguished panel of voices. It is my privilege to present Matt Gallagher, Sebastian Junger, Emma Skye, and Kael Weston. Thank you.
So it was May 2007, and I was working as the political advisor to General Odierno, who was the commanding general of US troops in Iraq. And we flew by helicopter from Baghdad to Anbar. In fact, we landed in Ramadi. And we got out of the helicopter, and we then got into Humvees. And it was, you know, it was May, so it already started to get really, really hot. So wearing full battle rattle, body armor, helmets, got into a Humvee, and it was Marines. There was a Marine gunner, driver, the other guy. And I looked across to the other seat, and there was a guy sitting in it. He looked like he was in his late 60s. And he didn't look like a reporter. I had no idea who he was. And it's really, really loud in a Humvee. You can't really, it's hard to have a conversation. So I just, you know, put my hand across and I said, "Hi, I'm Emma." And he said, "Hi, I'm Wayne." He didn't say anything else, he just said he was Wayne. And through the day, you know, we went out, we visited troops in their outposts. We went to see Iraqi security forces, local police, army, some of the tribal awakening guys. And, you know, I shared water with Wayne, had, shared a power bar with him. And at the end of the day, stopped back in Ramadi, got on a helicopter to go back to Baghdad. And on the helicopter, he had the headphones on, so I was talking to my boss, General Odierno. And we were both talking about what we'd seen during the day, and things were really improving in Ramadi. The town was coming back to life. The security forces were, taking control. The Iraqi security forces were taking control of their town. And so a conversation was going on. And I said to him, you know, sir, in my Humvee was, you know, this old guy called Wayne. I mean, do you know who Wayne is? And he said, you mean General Downing? So, I don't know. He just said his name was Wayne. And he said, well, that's General Downing, retired 4-star general who used to be head of special forces, you know, a really legend. And I thought, wow. And about 2-3 weeks later, I read in the paper in Stars and Stripes that General Downing had just died from a terminal illness. And that really struck in my mind because he obviously knew he was dying. And in his last weeks, he wanted to be back out in the field with troops on patrol. And it really, you know, it made me think a lot. So I wanted to kick off, you know, discussion by, you know, turning to you, Matt, and saying, if you had one day left in this life, how would you want to spend it?
I'm glad we're starting with the easy question. So a few weeks ago, we all observed Memorial Day in a variety of ways. I myself got a phone call from a friend of mine that I'd served in the Army with, and we'd both been out of the service at this point longer than we were actually in. And we were, you know, just talking about those days, those patrols, some of our fallen friends. And he made the point, you know, I find this Memorial Day, the Memorial Days are actually getting harder in a way, and I thought they'd actually get easier with the passage of time. And I agreed, and I think kind of we landed on this idea that you know our fallen friends, American and Iraqi young men and women are kind of forever fixed in memory. And as we go on with our lives and kind of make the transition that Sebastian talked eloquently about yesterday, and you know, finding new careers and getting married and having kids, it kind of makes their losses even more palpable, right? And you know, that kind of brings me back to your question in that one of those fallen friends was a lieutenant named Mark Daly, who graduated from UCLA. Was a true idealist in kind of every sense of the word, and we'd both gone to the officer basic course with him. And his mom, about 2 years after he'd passed, he was killed in a 400-pound IED strike in Mosul, Iraq, in January 2006. And she wrote a few of us and kind of charging us with, you know, living life as in a good and decent way, you know, whatever that means to you. And so, you know, it's kind of those words that I think of when you ask your question, and it would involve taking my wife to that Italian restaurant that I've been saying that I would for years. It would take my dog to the park, because, you know, what is joy if it's not a golden retriever bounding after a ball? Doing a turn at my mom's food bank that she runs in Virginia, playing basketball with my brother. You know, the small, quiet things that kind of make up life, but that are so vital to us all. And then, if I had a few hours left, I'd probably write like hell, because like all writers, I want the last word.
So, Kael, how would you spend your last day?
I can tell you where I would not spend it, which would be Iraq, probably. But and I should probably say I should be doing poetry here in Nantucket, or at least Martha's Vineyard. But I think I would probably be out west somewhere with the people who matter most. And beyond that, I probably wouldn't share it publicly.
Sebastian.
Yeah, it's a very simple and very complicated question at the same time. I definitely would not put myself in a war. War is a lot of different things, which is why it's so compelling. But it's, at the end of the day, it's incredibly sad and ugly. And I don't believe in an afterlife. But just in case, I don't think that would be the last effects of the world that I would want on me as I move on. I think I would want to be at home with the people that I love, talking with them about how my time with them affected me and made me a better person, and maybe hearing something similar from them about me. And I think try to reassure myself, and actually by doing that, ultimately reassuring them that they're going to be okay after I die. And I would actually want to hear from them that they won't take my passing as a loss, but as just another phase, and that they're going to be all right. I mean, that, you know, ultimately we want to make sure that the people we care about are going to survive, and I would want to know that for sure before I move on.
So we've all spent, you know, considerable time in war zones, particularly in these 9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you know, when you hear the stories of those who fought in the First World War and the Second World War, and what was achieved for the world from those wars. When you look at our wars, it's really hard to see that anything positive has come from those wars. You can look and think the Iraq War has triggered something in the Middle East that's led, in a way, to the meltdown of the Middle East, the unraveling of the Middle East, the meltdown of the European Union, and the end of Pax Americana, which has kept stability in the world since the end of the Second World War. So it's really hard to feel that we were part of something that created a better peace. So how should we look to find meaning from our service, what we did, the loss of all those lives, all that blood and treasure? Do you struggle with that? We'll start with Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that journalists should be objective, or really strive to be, and I was so against the Iraq War that I didn't cover it. I didn't think I could be objective. I started going to Afghanistan in the mid-90s during their horrific civil war. I was there in 2000 with Massoud's forces as he battled the Taliban. I rushed back there after 9/11. I saw Afghans just overjoyed that America was coming in, hopefully to end their civil war. I remember getting hugged on the streets of Kabul by Afghans when they found out that I was American. It was extraordinary. Obviously, we committed unbelievable mistakes, but I did see a lot of good, actually, despite the incredible mistakes. I don't know how. I don't know how the good effects survived the mistakes, but they did. The civilian casualty rate went way down when NATO got there, compared to the Civil War, but no one ever thinks about the Civil War because we weren't there yet. But in fact, conditions for people improved dramatically. I saw Kabul get rebuilt, Jalalabad, Kandahar, incredible changes in those cities. Infant mortality went down, maternal mortality went down. Something like 7 times as many children are now in school, and 1/3 of them are girls, which is a predictor of future political and economic stability. So there were real changes. As we've pulled out, we pulled out of a society that's been very, very much changed. And as we've pulled out, the civilian casualty rate, of course, has gone right back up, which breaks my heart. Just on a kind of, just in terms of our national interests, not theirs, but our national interests. Frankly, I mean, we went over there because of 9/11, and we went over there to kill or capture the top members of Al-Qaeda, and particularly bin Laden, and we did that. And we couldn't have done it from Northern Virginia. We really had to be there. So you know, as a journalist, I'm not in any way advocating anything, but I think it is good to point out the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons of decisions. The cons are obvious, I think, to everyone in the room. The pluses aren't as obvious, I think, because war is such an emotional topic. But without advocating one way or another, I think it's good to keep those effects in mind.
So I certainly can't speak for every post 9/11 American veteran. So I think it's vital that I clarify that first. But I think, like at least many, I'm simultaneously proud of my service and filled with a deep, deep sorrow with how Iraq has turned out. And yes, that's a dichotomy. But to paraphrase Whitman, you know, we're all filled with multitudes. You know, the thing that really strikes me as these kind of conversations of kind of the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan start to play out is you know, these were the first protracted wars in America's history fought by an all-volunteer force. There was no draft. And one of the, whether intentional or not, one of the kind of byproducts of that was a lack of engagement from vast swaths of American society. It was essentially outsourced. You know, I'm the son of two lawyers from Reno, Nevada. Generally speaking, people from that background didn't join the military after 9/11. I think that has some really harmful effects for us as a republic. I mean, we are not behaving like a republic. So if there's anything good that can come out of Iraq, from my vantage point, it's that we as a citizenry need to kind of take back how our foreign policy and how we engage that, and how these young idealists like Mark that I mentioned earlier, how great is it that we live in a society where we have young people like that willing to fight on behalf of the collective. But it's up to every single one of us, you know, now that I'm out, and I include myself in this, to demand that those young people are only sent when absolutely necessary, when all other options have been utterly exhausted. And that's hard. That's really hard. I realize that. There's all kinds of layers of bureaucracy and money between us and the power brokers. But we're a republic, and that's what republics do. And just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worth aspiring for. And you know, I think veteran or civilian, you know, whatever our station as a citizen, is if we're demanding our political leaders really wrestle through these things. I mean, for example, the last AUMF, Authorized Use of Military Force, that Congress passed was in November 2001 in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. They'll continue to fund, for example, our military operations against ISIS in Syria right now. But how ridiculous is it that we're still using the same AUMF that was passed for the Taliban in Afghanistan on ISIS in Syria? That doesn't make sense. It's an abdication of responsibility on their part. And unless we, as a collective, kind of take back that and demand some accountability, it's just these issues, this outsourcing of who wears the uniform, is just going to continue to get worse.
Tough question. I have a 600-page book that tries to answer some of these issues, but the short answer for me would be, I guess, to answer with a question I was asked by Fallujah's city council leader after you and I were in Baghdad, and I went out to Anbar again, and it was a very cutting, important question, which was, do Americans still remember us? And I think, you know, I've thought about that question a lot. So I would say that some of us maybe do, not enough, but not only do we remember the people that, you know, we worked with, but, you know, our attempt to write about them, I think, is part of, I think, that commitment, and maybe the biggest lesson, which is that I think there's an obligation to tell their stories because they can't yet. And the second part would be to follow what Matt said. I think the biggest lesson that I look at is only let your leaders start right wars. And I don't think it's that the leaders should get off the hook if they want to start a wrong war. So those would be my 2 points.
So Kael, in your book, The Mirror Test, there are a lot of dead people. There are a lot of graves that you're going to. And, you know, you're describing this, it makes very uncomfortable reading, because it's so easy for people to just try, you know, as Matt was saying, very few people are actually involved in these wars. In your writing, do you feel you're trying to hold our leaders accountable? I mean, if this was a different country, the leaders would be in The Hague for the Iraq War. But nobody has lost their job. Nobody's been held accountable. Nobody's been sent to jail, whether it's for the decision to go to war, the authorization of torture, any of those things. So a young guy could lose his weapon and, you know, be put in jail for it. But people who authorize torture, nothing happened to them. Are you trying to hold our leaders accountable?
Hell yeah. I mean, I don't absolve myself from decisions on the ground that we were implementing that didn't end well at all. But war, I think, is the most important thing a nation does. You know, we can argue over income taxes, mortgage rates, but there's nothing I think is tremendously strategic and tremendously horrific as once a war starts, and then how you try and stop a war. So it's an accountability frame for sure. I also think it's resurrection. I mean, I envy the fiction writers in the room because I'm trying to resurrect real people. And I feel like there's a certain power in just telling their stories as they lived. And you know, resurrection is never truly possible, but I think in a book, you remind yourself and you remind the reader that war is really about people that aren't the ones in Washington and that aren't the ones that kind of make the decisions. It's about, you know, Brian Bland, who's buried in Newcastle, Wyoming. It's about the Fallujahs who do ask, you know, do you remember us? And I guess I would end by saying, you know, it's too bad we don't have a few more chairs on the stage because the questions are very good, but I think the ultimate judge should be, you know, the Iraqi and the Afghan, and I hope one day we're reading their books as well, because I think those would probably be the most important forms of accountability.
So you're a civilian who volunteered and chose to go off to wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan and spent year after year working with Marines. Aren't they sort of the most dangerous, nasty, horrible, foul-mouthed people you could ever come across?
I can tell you love
Except
him as
Mary's
much
son,
as I
of course.
do.
I'm sure he's nice.
You know, there's no better company in a horrible, bad, dangerous place than the U.S. Marine Corps. And of course, my dad and uncles were all in the Army. But they are a tribe. And Sebastian, I think you put your finger on an important issue there. But I went native, and I was glad to go native. And if you're going to be shot at, there's no better protection than a 19-year-old Lance Corporal who grew up where I grew up, which is sort of with a gun in his hand at the age of 9. But I think the Marine Corps is also trying to tackle these questions. I write about going into the Marine Corps Museum and how are they trying to capture these wars. And I'll tell a quick story, which is they're building a multi-million-dollar wing now, and there are museums, and then there's the Marine Corps Museum. It's really a tremendous place to go see. And so as I would go with Marine friends and over the years, I once went with a former infantry company commander and his young son. And it was really a fascinating kind of experience to go with a guy who had seen the worst of Fallujah and really the worst of Helmand. And then I asked him, do you want your son to be a Marine? And he actually let me use his response in the book. But at the end of the museum tour, they had this little corner, and it was like the 9/11 wars. And it was truly like a couple of photos of poppy fields in Helmand, and then a helicopter, and I think election-related tribute about Iraq, and that was it. And you could tell the young Marines would walk in and do the grand tour of Iwo Jima, Chosin, World War II, all the big battles, and then at the end it's this, how do we capture Iraq and Afghanistan? Well, they're now starting that wing of the museum, and I don't envy the job of those curators. I really don't. They're going to put some of the election ballots that I sequestered from Fallujah, but I'm not sure that those ballots represent something that we can all say is sort of a trophy in any way. It's sort of a symbol of policy that, as you know, the Iraqis said, created disorder and death.
So Sebastian, when you were in Restrepo with those young guys, did you feel that you were becoming one of them? Did you feel that it was hard to maintain some distance as a journalist? And did you think that if you were 18, you'd want to be a soldier experiencing this?
Yeah. First of all, I should say that the Army and the guys that I was with would be deeply offended that you thought the Marines were the nastiest, most foul-mouthed. Who would file a complaint? Anyway, I actually grew up during Vietnam and in a very liberal family, liberal community. Every adult I knew was against Vietnam and outraged by it. When I got my selective service card in the mail, I mean, a lot of people don't even know what this is, but when boys turn 18, they get a card in the mail from their government. You can also see them at post offices. And the government wants to know where you live in case they need to draft you. Girls don't get this card. They don't have to register with their government in case their government needs them.
That's changing.
It might be changing, yeah. And I think it's an entirely healthy thing that there be parity between the sexes on that. But at any rate, I thought the draft ended. What the hell's this? I had no idea what it was. I was against the war, obviously, just because I'd absorbed, that ethos. And I said to my father, "What's this? I'm not signing this." And he said, "No, you are. You owe. I think I talked about this yesterday. He said, "You don't owe your country nothing." And he had grown up in Europe, and his country of France had been saved from fascism by the U.S. military. And he said, "You don't owe your country nothing, and you're going to sign that card." And when he put it that way, suddenly I was filled with this amazing sense of purpose and importance, like I belonged to something bigger. So when I was a young man, I definitely was not going to join the military. Frankly, in the environment that I grew up in, it had quite a bad name. But what I desperately wanted to be was to be part of something bigger, something noble, something where I was not important, but the thing that I was serving was important. And I think that's hardwired into young men and into people in general to want to be part of that. And when you give them the chance to be part of something like that after a disaster, during the Blitz in London, whatever it is, people respond incredibly well. And they actually look back on those days with enormous fondness and nostalgia. That was what I wanted. But it was the 1980s. There didn't seem to be any good wars to fight, and I was extremely skeptical of my government and of the military. And so imagine my surprise. And that attitude sort of lingered in me my whole life. And I became a war reporter. I covered wars all over the world. I just was never with U.S. forces because we weren't engaged in any. I was in Bosnia and Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Liberia, terrifying places. And so imagine my surprise when I got out there to the Korangal Valley, and I was in this small outpost, it's about the size of this room, with 20 guys and some ANA, and we were in combat constantly and sleeping on the ground, and it couldn't have been more primitive and frankly reproduced our evolutionary past probably pretty closely in terms of the group dynamics, and I just loved it. What I loved was being part of a group. I grew up in an affluent society where groups aren't needed, really. You can be an individual. And I couldn't, it's like holding a baby for the first time. He was like, wow, this feels unbelievably right. And we're clearly wired for this. And I really, I miss it enormously. I miss those guys. And I miss being the person I was with those guys.
So Matt, I met you for the first time yesterday. And you seem, a nice, well-adjusted young man. Clean-shaven.
You've only known me for a day.
And you can read and you can really write. You write using a lot of metaphors even. And, many things you could have done in life. What possessed you? I take it you weren't in trouble with the law. You hadn't been thrown out of school. So what possessed you from all the range of opportunities that you had to volunteer, to go to other countries and kill people who have no threat to you?
Lots of reasons. Though I'd quibble maybe with the no threat, at least, aspect of it, at least when you're joining up. like Sebastian said, I was a freshman in college when 9/11 occurred. And my brother and I were raised by two Vietnam War protesters whose parents had so both our grandfathers had served in World War II and Korea. So, you know, it really wasn't like a conversation at the dinner table every night growing up, but it was just kind of imbued in us, this healthy respect for the military and service members, but also a healthy skepticism for military force and how and when it's applied. You know, it was just kind of part of our family dynamic, and in that way, I think it kind of mirrored a generation of young Americans whose grandparents grew up during World War II, and then whose parents came of age during the Vietnam era. So, you know, kind of inheriting both of those very conflicting narratives, almost these dueling shadows, you know, was there for anybody between the ages of 15 and say 24 when 9/11 occurred. I myself was a freshman in college. You know, I wanted to join up to be part of something. It seems almost quaint now, given the last 15 years, but that felt like our generation's Pearl Harbor. It felt like a generational calling in that moment. I was in a unique place. I could go serve and do my part. Call it patriotism if you want. It was kind of patriotism that isn't necessarily the flag-waving kind, but I believe in many American ideals and felt like defending those were worth it. Did I think I'd end up in Iraq? I did not. I had deep misgivings about Iraq when it kicked off 2 years later. That said, there's something to be said for when you sign and join up to be part of an institution that you've now kind of, there's something freeing about that, right? And you can just focus on the small amount of good that you can do. And when I got to Iraq in 2007 with my 30-man scout platoon, you know, pushing a country back from the brink of civil war was a thing worth pursuing, was a thing worth trying to do and trying to do our damnedest to do. Yes, it was a civil war that our military had essentially helped initiate. But the two choices then were walk away and say sorry, or try to do something about it. And like a lot of service members, I'd rather get my hands dirty in the pursuit of good rather than kind of shaking my fist from the sideline in an effort to maintain some moral purity and righteousness. And you know, you don't have to do the military, join the military for that. You know, anybody that's been part of something, been part of an institution, worked towards some greater good, knows that dichotomy very well. Yeah, I think that answers your question.
And Kael, you chose diplomacy. Was that because you're just of a different era to Matt? Do you think if you'd been a guy at college during 9/11, you'd have wanted to go and be a Marine? Or has diplomacy always been a calling for you and do you still believe in it?
I believe in it even more now. You know, I was in New York when Secretary Powell held up the vial and said anthrax, so I was there at the very beginning of the 2 tracks. You know, we were trying to get a resolution in the UN Security Council that would theoretically slow down the war train, while at the same time, you know, the administration, I think, had pretty much already made its decision. As far as my bio, I used to hang out with the foreign exchange students in high school, so there was probably a pattern all the way back to when I was fascinated by people who lived far, far away, and I had maps on my wall. And my first research paper in Mr. Lindstrom's class was on the UN Security Council, so you only see this when you look back as you get gray hair. But, you know, diplomacy, I think the wars have... the stock should have risen significantly after these wars in terms of the civilian... I mean, our point of view is we try and stop war, right? But we found ourselves in the war, and I had some very good mentors, Ambassador Ford, Robert Ford being one, Ambassador Negapani as well. But I'm not sure that the lessons in that regard are yet fully appreciated. That what I found in a war zone, the Iraqis and the Afghans wanted was a normalization of, yes, state-to-state relationships, not a flooding of the zone of the military. And I think that still holds true. So diplomacy, I think, with the right kind of presidential leadership and the right kind of people in our country that say, slow down, you know, maybe we ought to think about some other steps before we send in the Marines and the Army again, is perhaps the most important lesson I take from a wrong war and a right war, because that's how I view the two. I think, you know, Iraq was a wrong war. Afghanistan, we had to at least start it. How we fought it, we could talk for hours and hours about. But I think a big lesson is that balance between political and military efforts, and it was very much an imbalance for most of the wars, and I think still is, actually.
So we can open up to questions from the floor.
20 years after the Vietnam War ended, American veterans and other Americans began going back to Vietnam, clearing unexploded ordnance and building schools for the blind and other charitable activities. Can you imagine American veterans returning to Afghanistan and Iraq 20 years from now and doing similar things?
I can imagine it. It takes a lot. It takes a stretch of the imagination. But you know, I know I'm not the only one that hopes and prays that those countries have the kind of stability and booming tourist economy that Vietnam has. It's really hard to see right now. I mean, the town my platoon and I were stationed in is right on that sectarian border separating the Republic of Iraq from the Islamic State. So, would I like to take my grandchildren there someday? Sure, but it takes a lot of wishful thinking.
I think the Iraqis will let us know when that time has arrived. It's going to be a while.
There's quite a few who go back to Iraqi Kurdistan, and that's in the north of Iraq. And Iraqi Kurdistan is, if you like, the successful part from the Iraq War, where the Kurds, their area has been flourishing. I mean, it's got some issues now because of the budget and the price of oil, but it is an area where Gold Star families have been going back to visit, and the Kurds have really welcomed them. You can also see veterans have set up some NGOs, some to provide education for Iraqi children, some medical care support. I personally, when I left Iraq in 2010, I couldn't stay away. So I was going back every 6 months. But there aren't many who do that because it's too dangerous, really. I mean, I had very good Iraqi friends, so I go and see them and they look after me and take me around. But it's really hard to imagine because so many people in Iraq feel that we destroyed their country and they feel that we did it on purpose. So in all the conspiracy theories that go on, they think we want to keep the Middle East weak, we want to make sure Sunni and Shia fight and kill each other all the time. So they blame us for a lot of the things going on. So I think it's going to be a long time.
So my question, Emma, you've been wonderful at explaining and helping us understand how they made this choice. You were a rare female voice in a predominantly male military world. Why did you make the choice you made to make this your life?
So I was somebody who was very much against the war. And I wanted to go out to Iraq to apologize to Iraqis for the war and to make sure that the only Westerner they met wasn't somebody like Matt. That was before I met Matt. So I actually think Matt's quite nice. But I didn't want the only foreigner that they ever met would be somebody with a gun. You know, I'd spent a decade living in Israel, Palestine. I spoke Arabic. I liked the place. I liked the culture. So I didn't go out as part of the overall initiative. I didn't want to be part of that. I was very much against it. Now, just by various circumstances, and I think I explained a little bit yesterday that I was sort of blown up in my first week. And so it made me realize that it didn't matter who you were, what your motives were. Any foreigner in Iraq was thought of as part of the US project. I couldn't say, look, I'm not an American, can't you hear my accent? It didn't matter. Everybody was seen as part of the US project. And, you know, there was me, supposed to be running a province, and there were 3,000 American soldiers there. The same American soldiers that Sebastian ends up with in Afghanistan, the 173rd Airborne Brigade. And I thought, you know, I have a choice. Do I just sit here? And when I first arrived, I had my filofax, and I was taking notes on everything they did. And I warned the brigade commander. I warned him that if I found him, you know, after I got blown up, he said, we're going to hunt those guys down, we're going to get them. And I said, look, they're attacking me because I'm a symbol of an illegal occupation. And I went the next day with the 4th Geneva Convention. I downloaded it onto my laptop, and I sat there and I read it to this colonel, line by line. And I told him that if I found him violating any of those articles, I would take him to The Hague. Now, at this stage, I didn't know that America is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, and you can't take Americans to The Hague. It was early days. And he, remarkably, was, you know, he looked at me and he thought, hey, you know, female, feisty, and he thought I was his replacement. So the military had jumped in, liberated Iraq, and they thought they were going home. And in their doctrine, you have the military comes, you know, they smash and they blow things up and they kill lots of people, and then their job is done, and the civilians are supposed to come in. People like Kael and me, but there aren't many people like us. There are very few of us. And so when I arrived, this colonel thought that I was his replacement, the first of the civilians coming to replace the army. And he said, we're going to just do a handover. A left seat, right seat, or a right seat, left seat in my case. He said, we'll just do this handover, and then I'll go and you'll be in charge. And I thought, you know, for 2 weeks I can tolerate this man. I thought it's just going to be 2 weeks. And so I went everywhere with him, introduced me to everybody, and 2 weeks came and went. And during these 2 weeks we realized that we'd got the same objectives, and that was to get Kirkuk back on its feet, with Iraqis running their own affairs so the US military could withdraw. And the more I got to know him, I realized he wasn't all bad. You know, he'd actually read some books, much to my surprise. We'd actually read the same books. And I thought, why on earth did you join the army? You know, why? And, you know, I realized we'd actually got the same values. And when the 2 weeks came and went, and we both realized that I wasn't the first of the civilians, I was it, and he wasn't going anytime soon. He said, look, you know how to do this nation-building stuff much better than we do. Why don't I just give you some of my paratroopers to be your staff? And so before I knew it, I had all these guys to work for me. I'd appeared in their organizational chart, and I had been subsumed into them, become part of them. And elsewhere in the country, it was like there must be a gap between civilians and military. Well, I was all on my own, reporting to a guy in Baghdad who didn't really have much contact with me. And I thought, no one's going to notice, really. So whenever Ambassador Bremer came to visit, which was rare, I would sit in the main seat, and the colonel would be my military advisor. And whenever military guys came to visit, which was all the time, he would be in the main seat, and I would be his political advisor. And there was one report that was written. I wrote the report. And if it was military channel, he signed it. If it was civilian channel, I signed it. And so there we were, in the middle of nowhere, really, with this province to run, with no instructions, no advice, nobody telling us what they wanted, what they expected. And we worked day in, day out to try and prevent a civil war. And so I got sucked in. And, you know, it was 2 years later, General Odiena writes me this email, would I come and be his political advisor for the surge all through that time? And so that's how it happened. And so I ended up, Tony Blair on his last visit to Iraq, comes to Baghdad. And I ended up being introduced to the British Prime Minister by General Petraeus and General Odierno. And they said, oh, she's British. And Blair looked at me and he said, are you really British? I said, yes, I am British, born and bred. I've still got the accent. I am British. And he said, what on earth are you doing working with the US Army? You know, I was sent out as part of the British contingent, and now I'm working with the US Army. And I didn't have a good answer for him at that moment, and so I just said, Stockholm Syndrome. And at that moment, we came under attack. The rockets started coming down. The Iranians had got a whiff of his visits, and so it was take cover, take cover. And so it's the only conversation I ever had with Tony Blair. So I never got to talk to him about the decision to put us in this position in the first place. So a long answer to your question, but when you're put in these really difficult circumstances, you build bonds with people. Even bad people. Because you are thrown together. They feed you, they protect you, they look after you, and you become part of it. And what Sebastian has spoken about and written about, this thing called tribe. And so you look at somebody like me, the organization that I feel part of, more part of than any other organization I've ever belonged to, is the US Army. And infantry paratrooper, if you just want to know my precise clan, which I feel so much a part of because they made me feel a part of it. And I think that says an awful lot about the US military. You can see 3 of us here on this platform are not in the military, and I'm obviously foreign, female, all of that. And yet that organization was inclusive. I felt I had a role. I felt I was needed. I had purpose. And I became part of it. So much so that, you know, the general sends me off to speak on his behalf, the colonel sends me off to speak on his behalf, and people just accept that, you know, I just happen to speak on behalf of the US Army at particular events at times. But that's kind of how it happened.
And I'll say, I'll borrow your mic. Just to say that with the bell tolling at 12 noon, we are really happy to announce that all of our writers will be signing books immediately following this. And I think this concludes our, I don't know if Emma has a last word.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.